we're entering the last section, so please keep up the spirit and let's start. This panel, we are very fortunate to have two presenters. The first one is Marina from University of Munich. He's also the members of the Inequality groups, and also the Shu-Fen from交大大学 Cultural and Institute of Cultural Studies, yes. So social research and cultural studies, yes. And she's I think her background is from political science. Yeah. So they are going to present present papers about refugee. Okay, as a really main important significant problem right now. It's a global problem and also it's a local, it's a more local manifestation. And refugee is not just simply a question of outsider and insider. It's also a question of how to deal with what kind of technology, political technologies go involved in order to construct refugee, construct foreigners, that kind of problem. So it's central problem in contemporary political science, political philosophy. I know that we just had a panel talk about how under the neoliberal regime, how this problem challenging not only the liberal tradition, the whole liberal tradition of political philosophy, also challenging the Foucauldian approach to this problem. So this is one of the topics that I think is worthy of large attention. So without further ado, let's start with Dr. Go.
I take you back to 2015 when I started with the Egalitarianism project and the peak of what was labeled the European refugee crisis. I present to you two iconic pictures of the crisis. One was very individualistic, the picture of a drowned child, the drowned angel it was called, and that elicited a lot of solidarity and sympathy. And the other one is the picture of the overflowing boat, no faces, mostly male, that elicits a very different response. And these are pictures of other types of responses, mainly in the media. And they represent the scope of paradoxical attitudes raised around the refugee crisis at the time, and today as well. Solidarity on the one hand, and a surge of human rights activism, and a populist whiplash against the EU's open border policies, which then resulted in Brexit. The events of the refugee crisis, which no longer takes such predominance in the media, but has not ended, enables us to consider the paradoxical dynamics of egalitarian movements and its implications for the transformations of the nature of the state. In 2015, the numbers of refugees, they were talked about as 1 million, 1.5 million people moving across Europe. The numbers increased in 2016 and then radically decreased when they closed the Balkans route and they implemented border controls and created zones of exception, zones of exclusion where refugees were sort of corralled and stopped from getting into Europe. So basically there were different types of reactions around the refugee crisis. There were the governmental reactions, the bureaucratic reactions, transnational social movements, and all of them were contradictory and paradoxical. So the point of this paper, the point of my research during the Egalitarianism project, was to look at the refugee crisis as an event through which we can untangle the many threads that make up the complex tapestry of the structures and institutions with often conflicting intentions, and in the context of the egalitarian ideal. So the refugee crisis was, the peak of which was in 2015, 2016, as a social situation, has materialized a series of global processes transforming the nature of the state. As an event, it reveals the dynamics between key structures that influence and govern the movement of people, state, media, NGOs, corporations, and social movements. The view here portrayed, or the view that I was mostly focusing on, was a very European view, which was pretended to be a global view as well, mostly because it was a view taken through the role of NGOs, and NGOs have this sort of universal transnational configuration and appeal, and especially because of their relationship to human rights. But I was physically positioned in Switzerland, which was an interesting place because it's not really the European Union. It has a very antagonistic relationship to the European Union. It's a center of corporate power. They have a very particular idea about the state. It's not supposed to sort of, the state is counteracted in everyday politics, the centralized state. But at the same time, it's the center of the headquarters of most international NGOs, and particularly their corporate branches of fundraising. So Marshall Salins argues that the event is formed through human imaginings and interpretations, which in itself sets the event into motion, the nature of conjuncture, which then gets interpreted in a particular sense. An event is always a construction. I was interested in how, or anthropologists in general are interested in how events are constructed. And the event that I was looking at was the refugee crisis. In the construction of the refugee crisis, the media had a central role, but NGOs and particularly human rights organizations were key pillars of the management and articulation of the discourse around refugees, of the programs for refugee integration and the management of people cross borders, and even to the extent of influencing governments and policies around immigration. Human rights and humanitarianism are premised on a sovereign nation state, radically transformed through the corporatization of political borders. The increase of refugees arriving in Europe has seen the growing collaboration of NGOs, state organizations, and corporate foundations to attenuate the crisis, exemplified best by the declarations of the International Committee for the Red Cross President Peter Maurer in 2017, who insisted on the collaboration between corporations and humanitarian organizations as the best way to move forward with aid, as a model of aid. These emerging configurations of international organizations raise questions regarding structures of governance of people and territory in the context of transforming state structures. The way in which different NGOs engaged with the refugee crisis and their varying associations with human rights as an egalitarian discourse of Western liberal tradition require a re-examination of the structural context that frames the relationship between human rights, humanitarianism, and the state in light of the impact of the refugee crisis in Europe. The emergence of human rights discourse and humanitarian institutions are closely associated with the formation of the nation state and the post-war decolonization period. As Harold Bond and Butera argued in 1992, the history of refugees in the 20th century was a result of the emergence of the sovereignty of the nation state. The forging of the nation state and liberal democracy as form and as ideology imply that human rights, humanitarianism, and the state are closely interconnected, interrelated in often contradictory ways. NGOs defended the right of migrants and provide health, housing, and integration services, while increasing right-wing anti-immigrant populist parties pitch the rights of the individual and the freedom of the individual and equality against a perceived threat of over-foreignization in defense of European liberal traditions. Brexit, Trump, the EU-Turkey deal, and increasing border controls are legitimated by political discourses drawing on liberal views of equality, freedom against religious extremism, and the defense of the hazy idea of a European way of life. The contradictory relations between NGOs, supporting refugees and human rights discourse are manifestations of an inherent potential for crisis in the structures of the state that gave rise to the humanitarian system and was closely connected to the formulation and the articulation of the human rights regime from its inception. At a time when the state form is shifting, some of its moral pillars are being transformed. Just as a parenthesis, I want to give you a bit of an idea of how I was dealing with egalitarianism, the concept of egalitarianism within my own project, and perhaps I won't get through paper. So briefly, throughout the project, we have understood egalitarianism as a generalized movement against orders that constrain. The kind of resistances are defined by the orders they oppose. Egalitarianism is a force that exists within all systems, that takes on different expressions, and has therefore to be looked at in different struggles, never fully resolved. The only way to understand egalitarianism, therefore, is to look at these different forces at different points in time and different locations and see how they express the struggles of egalitarianism. Egalitarianism is not about equality. It's not just about equality. It's about alteration. It's a millennial concept, and it looks at forms and processes that place a restriction, a constraint, a disadvantage. And it is also a value which at some point breaks through another system of values. And it has the potential to break through at any time. It is a dynamic transformation, even when it does not completely manage to subvert the hegemonic hierarchy. In the current crisis of values, we can see the egalitarian force breaking through at particular moments or events when repressive systems or processes are momentarily subverted. We can see a moment of egalitarianism. And any egalitarian movement is a moment that draws on imaginary power of human beings, because it needs imagination to reconfigure the world. The refugee crisis, therefore, is a form of egalitarian movement that reacts against constraining and repressive processes such as austerity, intervention in government by governments, in other governments' policies, proxy wars, displacements, ecological damage. And human rights movements and organizations claim to be the locus of these egalitarian processes, which aim to draw from the humanitarian imagination, such as the right to claim asylum, the right to a life free of violence, the right to health and security, in order to revert the structures that become increasingly exclusionary. But are human rights really an egalitarian movement? I argue not completely. Instead, they reveal the corporate state formation, as I will shortly outline in a brief history of the consolidation of human rights in the post-World War II era. So human rights, which is a Western egalitarian discourse par excellence, are instead deeply embedded within the formation of the modern nation state through the structures of NGOs, and have accompanied the articulation of the corporate state from within the structures of the nation state, a topic that we'll discuss further tomorrow. Well, I'll talk about that first, and then I'll try and get through more ethnographic vignettes about the relationship between NGOs, human rights, and refugees through my research. So, human rights and NGOs. Refugees have provoked the mobilization of egalitarian discourse in the West, namely human rights and democracy, which attempt to be egalitarian responses to the crisis. However, in practice, human rights discourses and organizations have been serving the role of palliative care, and in many places they have taken on the role of health, education, social security provision, infrastructure development, freeing state structures and funds in Europe for more corporate concerns. NGOs thrived in the 1980s and 90s with development discourse and decolonization to become the legitimizers of the liberal state. With the spread of neoliberalism, the state retreated in the funding of NGOs, which were forced to seek their own funding, and MSF, the Médecins Sans Frontières, boasts of being 90% funded by individuals, as if that is something positive. many of which then turned to corporate sponsorship, and particularly through increasing movements of corporate social responsibility. This was part of a global discourse to reduce the welfare state, a discourse against the state, and increase the social responsibility of corporations, all the while granting them market tools like advertisement material, tools to access destitute locations, new markets. This is all about the new new development economics. It's about seeing the poor as part of the market, and creating the humanitarian market as well. The humanitarian space as a market, as a niche market. NGOs have also become key players in resistance movements, and for example, in water conflicts in Bolivia, mining in South Africa, refugee crisis in Europe, and they become the civil society that represents dispossessed groups against foreign corporations, hostile states, and other forms of repression. A brief history of the emergence of human rights cannot ignore the initial association with the landed aristocracy. Property was the origin of human rights, and in the 17th century, English property rights were the first precursors of what later became human rights. Human rights were also closely associated with liberal conceptions of the body and the person, with the individual at their core. That is crucially a very Western and European formation. And even while the whole corpus of human rights has been critiqued as very Eurocentric and has tried to incorporate alternative ways of being in the world, they have not ceased to be Eurocentric, particularly in their structures of application. So they're still very much centered on the law, they're very much centered on bureaucratic structures, and they have a very particular idea of the state in mind. The principle of solidarity is old, and history is replete with instances of what we might today call humanitarian aid, like religious institutions, localized association skills. But what characterizes the humanitarian system today is its transnational character, its international reach, and the fact that it acts on behalf of individuals of different states. And so it's not just representing local people, it represents humanity at large. And it's constructed around structures that are also transnational, so legal structures and governmental structures that are loosely associated, and they form what we call the humanitarian system. International organizations, they form a hierarchical ordering through state-like mechanisms. They focus mostly on the global south, and they have a hierarchy of values that they apply. They have models of behavior and models of governance that are to be exported and imported. And they have democracy and the law as key pillars in how they organize their functioning. They also, by declaring a situation, a humanitarian situation, in many ways they simplify crises that are complex, that are local, that have local implications, and they turn them into a broader issue of humanitarian assistance, and they bring in a very particular set of morals and values which is regulated by human rights. So this is just to try and get it a bit now into some more ethnographic detail. And the work that I did was with mostly with Médecins Sans Frontières, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and they're very different organizations. So when you start to work with these organizations, they won't all say that they work with human rights. So Médecins Sans Frontières, they don't associate themselves as a human rights organization, whereas Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, they do. And this is there's a lot of literature on the classification, categorization of human rights organizations and the humanitarian system, and it has to do with how they see their roles. So human rights organizations are more advocacy oriented, and they are more they stick to the rule of law as their guiding principle, and they denounce the atrocities that take place in different parts of the world, whereas humanitarian organizations are more about emergency relief. So they go into a crisis, they provide relief, and technically when the crisis is over, they're supposed to leave the crisis. However, MSF has been in some places in Africa for 30, 40 years, and if they were to leave, the crisis would continue. So many representatives of these organizations feel that that the principles by which these organizations are structured are not really, they don't match the practice that they have to take on every day. You know, why wouldn't they be able to give palliative care to the elderly if they are in those locations for so many years that they see people age? So there's a bit of discrepancy between the practice and the theory of these organizations. One particular event that I participated in was a discussion between Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. They were going to discuss about safe passage through Europe, and I was to do the introduction. I was asked specifically to say, you know, that MSF was not a human rights organization. It was very important to make that distinction, because they wanted to uphold the principle of impartiality, which they held very key to how they function. But MSF needs to position itself in opposition to the International Committee for the Red Cross, against which they separated in the 1930s, 40s, I can't remember now, 60s actually, because they saw the International Commission for the Red Cross as not denouncing the atrocities that they saw in the terrain, and the way in which MSF does it is by bearing witness. So they hold events that are closed events to their own participants, and they bring in the witnesses and people who have been there and seen it and can talk about it. This particular event brought in Exhibit A, who was a refugee, who had been through the whole Balkans route, and he had finally arrived in Switzerland, and he was there to tell his story, you know, as a way of bearing witness. The MSF wasn't able to help them once they arrived in Switzerland, because their role is to help people in the third world. So this man was in a very dire situation in Switzerland. He didn't have an apartment. He wasn't able to be unified with his family who lived in Geneva, because he had to stay in the refugee detention center in Zurich. He wasn't able to be given a job or a job recommendation letter by MSF. So in a sense, the NGO that was representing this refugee wasn't able to support him because he was out of context. Another event that I participated in was a Human Rights Watch annual fundraising event, where all of the creme de la creme of Switzerland attended. Switzerland, they lived in Switzerland. They were American, they were English, with their fur coats, etc. And the researchers from Human Rights Watch had to showcase their poor and destitute. So I got there a bit earlier because I was a volunteer, and they were practicing their speech with a voice that cracked, you know, with emotion. And then there was a public bid, so people could bid, put money, charity, and their names would appear on the screen, and the amount of times that they bid, their names would appear that many times. I'm not supposed to tell you this. I had to sign a confidentiality agreement. So just if you're going to publish it in Chinese. But this is the internal structure of these NGOs and how they work. It's a very corporate organization. The other instance was a corporate meeting by the Credit Suisse Research Institute, who brought in David Miliband to give a talk to the bankers to kind of educate them on social issues. And he talked about the importance, about the crux of the refugee crisis, according to him. But I mean, his insights were actually quite interesting. He was looking at the refugee crisis as a symptom of the corporate state, even though he didn't say it in so many words. And things that have been said in the morning were also coming up in these talks, where the city is becoming the locus of the management of refugees. So there's refugee programs that are funding cities. For example, I can't remember, there's a bank that is financing refugee management programs that is looking at how cities manage refugees. And it's the city is becoming the institution through which these managements of people are centralizing. Because refugees kind of open up this failure in the nation state to manage people, and this lack of interest in the corporate state, which manages capital. And so they fall within these gaps. And these are people that are not in the interest, they don't move in the interests of the corporate state, and they are not interesting to the nation state, because the nation state has to take responsibility for these people. So by including cities as the management centers, and through, of course, the assistance of NGOs and their privately raised funds, then these programs become available to, for example, re-educate, resettle refugees. I mean, in Switzerland, one of the biggest issues is how people get an apartment, because no one wants to rent an apartment to a refugee, because refugees can be their status can be taken away at any time. As soon as the situation reverts, they can be sent back. And in fact, sometimes families are split, they've broken up. So the father is sent back, but the mother and the child are left behind, because they're left in Switzerland because they fit the model of the humanitarian victim, you know, the woman and the child. So I have 1 minute left, but basically, I suppose the epitome of this corporatization of the management of refugees is the association between the International Committee for the Red Cross and the World Economic Forum, and through the role of Peter Maurer, who is the president of the ICRC, but also a secretary at the World Economic Forum, and has openly spoken about this need for corporate organizations to pair up with NGOs, human rights NGOs, humanitarian institutions, to actually help manage the issue of refugees, which he would argue is not just the concern of the state, but it is rather, it's much more efficient and much more sustainable to do it through a corporate management project. So I'll leave that there. I'm sure there's lots of unanswered points, but we can talk about it later.
I'm not sure whether I should thank Alan for inviting me to this conference, because, I used to work on political theories, but for the last couple of years, I kind of shift my research to more kind of historical or more ethnographic research, but only at a very early stage. But so my talk today will not address the question of egalitarianism directly. And it will not be a kind of presentation of a complete work. I just say it's the very early stage of my research. So what I'm going to kind of share with you is more like a kind of part of a background of the research projects I've been involved for the past 2 years. And to be very brief, the project is about the Vietnamese community in Taiwan. And the Vietnamese community in Taiwan actually, well, it consists mainly of Vietnamese refugees or the former boat people, marriage immigrants, and migrant workers. And instead of talking about different issues surrounding Vietnamese communities, such as their networking, community formation among different generations of Vietnamese who came to Taiwan with different status by different routes, or the social integration or inequalities experienced by them, I will focus specifically on the refugee problem in Taiwan from the historical perspective. And so the discussion will not be confined to the problem of Vietnamese refugees, but I hope by the end of the talk the relevance will become clear to you. So it will be more about kind of history and less about theory, concepts, and generalizations. Okay, so I hope I will not expose you with the kind of historical details too much. Okay, so let me start with telling a recent story of the controversy over the legislation of the refugee law in Taiwan. So as a matter of fact, a draft, so only a draft, we don't have a refugee law now. A draft of refugee law has been introduced to the Legislative Yuan, which is equivalent to the parliament in Taiwan, since 2005, and passed the first reading only in 2016. Since then, the draft has not been sent for further review. Admittedly, over the past 15 years, apart from a very small number of human rights organizations which try to pressure government and opposition parties to pass the law, the legislation of refugee law has not attracted too much attention. This general indifference to the problem of refugee has been somehow changed, thanks to the ongoing mass protests in Hong Kong. So for the past 6 months, with the escalation, here is actually, what? Doesn't work? Well, okay, this one. This one is actually provided by the Amnesty International about this mass arrest in Hong Kong. So for the past 6 months, with the escalation of violence both from the police and the protesters, more and more demonstrations were ruled illegal and were followed by mass arrest. According to some news reports, up to now, more than 6,000 people were arrested, more than 1,000 were charged with rioting, and among them, more than 500 were successfully prosecuted. In the meantime, Amnesty International also denounced the apparent thirst for retaliation of Hong Kong security forces and their disturbing pattern of reckless and unlawful tactics against people during the protests and arrested persons in custody. And in fear of being arrested, some protesters began to flee Hong Kong and seek asylum in Taiwan. In solidarity with them, some prominent political dissidents from Hong Kong and local human rights activists called on the Taiwanese government to provide more humanitarian aid and grant them political asylum. Despite expressing grave concern over the situation in Hong Kong and its support for the cause of the movement, the Taiwanese government nevertheless has until now remained reluctant to speed up legislation of the refugee law and persisted that humanitarian aid mechanisms are already in place and sufficient. The passage of the refugee law is now the priority. For human rights activists, however, the so-called existing mechanism reiterated by the government obviously lack a clear stipulation in terms of process of procedures. There is no allocation of personnel and other resources. Worse still, since the principle of no refoulement is not included, those ineligible to apply for the residence permit under current regulations, or those who seek straightforward political asylum, which does not exist basically in Taiwan, will not be protected. But to be sure, for those human rights activists, the passage of the refugee law is important not only because of the emergency situation in Hong Kong, but a responsibility to protect refugees in general. But ironically, however, even if the draft refugee law is passed under the circumstances, it applies only to foreigners and stateless people, which within the current constitutional framework does not include Chinese nationals. So that means it does not include the protesters from Hong Kong. So neither protesters from Hong Kong nor Chinese political dissidents nor Tibetans in exile are to be formally recognized as refugees. Obviously, everything hinges on the lingering question over the definition of a refugee and the complicated politics across the Taiwan Strait. But as we know, the definition of the term refugee established in 1951, or the 1967 kind of extension, has been criticized for its limitations. According to this definition, a refugee is an individual who is outside his or her country of nationality or habitual residence, who is unable or unwilling to return due to a well-founded fear of persecution based on his or her race, etc. Okay, yes. Apply this definition, the internally displaced persons and stateless individuals are not considered refugees. So, although the Republic of China, Taiwan, is no longer a UN member state and does not ratify the 1951 convention, the draft refugee law nevertheless adopts a similarly narrow definition. And therefore, that's my first main point. It cannot rid itself of the so-called China factor, if I'm allowed to use the buzzword. The impact of the China factor on the ROC government's position towards the refugee law or refugee problem can be traced back to the first decade of the Cold War. Indeed, even if we leave aside the massive repatriation after the Second World War or the mass exodus from mainland China around 1949, the history of receiving refugees in Taiwan is much longer and more complicated than is usually thought. In the context of Chinese Civil War, the decolonization movement in Southeast Asia and its entanglement with the Cold War, the ROC in Taiwan was one of the preferred destination countries for the Chinese refugees to seek asylum. And it is also in this context that the ROC government developed, I would say, a peculiar refugee regime that dealt mainly with the problem of the Chinese refugees and distanced itself from other international refugee problems most of the time, where the problem of the Vietnamese or Indo-Chinese refugees in the mid-1970s was the only exception. In contrast to a reluctance to pass a refugee law and provide political asylum to those exiles from Hong Kong at present, the ROC government was enthusiastic about internationalizing the problem of the Chinese refugees in Hong Kong in the early 1950s. It took the initiative in submitting a draft resolution to the UN Assembly requesting the UNHCR to set up a Far East branch office, which did not exist, and recognize the influx of Chinese people to Hong Kong after 1949 as refugees. In fact, the problem of the Chinese refugees in Hong Kong was extremely controversial in that it involved multiple stakeholders. At the core of the controversy was the duality of Chinese government, the politics of Cold War migration, and the gap between the strict legal and the broader humanitarian perspectives on the issue of refugees. So now let's take a look at the table. It's a bit, not very clear. But I would just say that it involved multiple stakeholders, including UNHCR and the United Kingdom and the Hong Kong government, and also the United States and the Ford Foundation, and also, of course, the ROC and the CCP. And so just very briefly, for the UNHCR, what they are concerned is whether the Chinese people fall within the mandate of the UNHCR. And they will also want to use that as a kind of opportunity to attract US support and funding, and also to extend their influence beyond Europe, because we know that the 1951 convention is so Eurocentric. And so, but they are also concerned about, the controversy over the two rival Chinese government. It is very complicated. If those who recognize PRC will consider the people, the exodus from China to Hong Kong as refugees. For those who recognize ROC as a representative of China, then those people fled China to Hong Kong will not be considered as refugees because they are supposed to be able to be helped by the ROC. So it's actually very, very complicated. So according to the Hangro report, which was kind of commissioned by the UNHCR to conduct an independent investigation into the situation of a Chinese refugee in Hong Kong, they would call those refugees with only relative eligibility. So only relative, okay? And so I will just maybe skip the details of all these, their stakes, the concerns. but we can have a look of the U.S. position. It's quite interesting because in a way is compatible with the U.S. Cold War anti-communist refugee policy, but still U.S. tried to have its own refugee policy independent of the UNHCR mandate. And with the help of this private foundation like the Ford foundations, they will become prominent and well-educated anti-communist defectors. And and they would also resettle, they prefer to resettle those refugees either in Taiwan or in Southeast Asia with the help of British government to play a role as an anti-communist propagandist to influence overseas Chinese population. But the problem is, I mean, domestically, there is a kind of controversy over whether all those fled from Red China are political refugees or whether they were only kind of rice refugees. So at that time, there is already a kind of distinction between refugees and migrants. And for the Republic of China, because they want to use this as an opportunity to kind of consolidate their own image as a kind of anti-communist, represent the only legitimate representative of China. So they try to internationalize the problem of the Chinese refugees in Hong Kong, and they will kind of advocate for extending assistance to Chinese refugees beyond European refugees in China. Because at the time we know they were European refugees in China, and most of the operations of the International Refugee Organization, or earlier on the UNHCR, actually they were engaged, but they kind of only focused on the European refugees in China instead of the Chinese refugees. Okay, and so for the CCP, actually they deny the authority of the UNHCR, although they kind of collaborate with them in helping the European refugees. And they consider this problem of the Chinese refugee in Hong Kong as a kind of international conspiracy to embarrass the newly founded the state of People's Republic of China. So for them, there was no such a thing as refugee problem, because Hong Kong eventually is part of China, and its residents are all Chinese nationals. And also, before then, there's a right of Chinese to move across the border. Basically, there was no restrictions over the movement. Okay, so that's kind of the controversy. And finally, with the landmark resolution passed in 1957, the problem of the Chinese refugees was recognized as a concern to the international community and warranted a long-term assistance. As a historian, Laurent McDougall observed, throughout the Cold War, development in Hong Kong had a profound impact on how refugees were conceptualized and how notions of refugee production evolved globally. Indeed, for the first time since its establishment, the UNHCR agreed to use its good offices to help internationally displaced persons regardless of their former status. And that first state was later on generalized into a good offices doctrine. Okay, there are of course many issues to be explored further. For instance, apart from the limited Eurocentric definition of refugee status, we can also see a strong legacy of colonialism and blatant racism when it comes to the question of resettlement. One should not forget that Chinese migration was still banned or subject to racialized immigration quotas in many white settler societies, and many Southeastern Asian countries had also just started to restrict the Chinese migration at that time. So as such, in one policy recommendation from the Hambro report, the Chinese refugees were seen as a kind of surplus labor to be resettled to British colonies or South African or South American countries like the indentured labor in the 19th or 20th century. The immigration policy of those white settler countries did not change until the Vietnamese refugee crisis broke out in the 1970s, and I will talk about it later. So let's come back to the ROC government. Despite its efforts in campaigning for enhancing the welfare of the Chinese refugees in Hong Kong, the ROC government was not willing to accept a large number of refugees for financial and security reasons. It's also worth mentioning that overseas Chinese from Hong Kong and Macau were not allowed to visit Taiwan until 1967. But unlike overseas Chinese with dual nationalities, like those in Southeast Asia, they had to provide a Taiwanese guarantor and go through a stricter review process. Moreover, like their predecessors, those who were resettled in Taiwan were not recognized as refugees, but they were named anti-communist defectors, destitute compatriots, or returning overseas Chinese, and so on. So the term refugee was erased from official documents and public discourses for the sake of one China. In other words, throughout the Cold War, the refugee problem, like the ROC government was concerned about, was the problem of Chinese refugees, but these were the refugees that could not formally recognize as refugees. So now I will now turn to the problem of Vietnamese refugees in the mid-1970s, which, as mentioned earlier, was the only exception that the ROC government was engaged in the international refugee problem. The problem of the Vietnamese refugees for ROC government was as complicated as the problem of the Chinese refugees in Hong Kong, but for different reasons. First of all, the problem was deeply entangled with the nationality question faced by overseas Chinese in South Asia after the Second World War. In the case of South Vietnam, overseas Chinese were forced to change their nationality since the mid-1950s. With the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, the relevance of nationality questions was really large. After all, it sets the order of evacuation. Overseas Chinese community leaders who could prove their staunch anti-communist stance would be given first priority and could be evacuated with their direct relatives. Others with overseas compatriot identity certificates or proof of Chinese ethnicity may apply for the passport and entry permit by themselves. So one can say, after all, it is still a Chinese refugee problem, or to be more precise, an overseas Chinese refugee problem that was at stake. But this will be related to my second point. The composition of the so-called overseas Chinese refugees in Vietnam was diverse, not only because of the nationality question, owing to the Cold War alliance between the ROC and the Republic of Vietnam over the 2 decades before its demise. The so-called overseas Chinese refugee in Vietnam consists of Chinese Vietnamese families living in Vietnam for generations, and with some of them fleeing from North Vietnam after 1954. That's the Chinese Vietnamese families, and also the ROC nationals who were sent to South Vietnam on tasks. Difference in terms of the background was often reflected in the routes, the modes of transport, and the resettlement of the refugees. Thirdly, since the ROC government lost its UN seat in 1971 as a repercussion of the changing dynamic of the global Cold War, when it came to the problem of the overseas Chinese refugee in Vietnam, the ROC government did not appeal to the international community as it did with the Hong Kong case. On the contrary, the ROC government was engaged, actually involuntarily, in rescuing the Vietnamese refugees. Apart from those rescued on the high sea and brought directly to Taiwan, many Vietnamese refugees, especially those with Chinese ethnic background, was transferred to Taiwan after they were denied entry to the neighboring countries, or after they were sheltered in the refugee camps on Guam or in Subic Bay for a short period of time. So it's actually this one is quite special because those people, like around 2,000 Vietnamese refugees, I use the quotation mark because those were the refugees who were, belonged to the first group of refugees that were sent to the Guam, the U.S. military bases. But they were here to protest against being a kind of forced refugees by the U.S. government. They actually demanded immediate repatriation back to Vietnam. Okay, and that's the reception center. People in Hong Kong, it's ironically that they might be the former refugees in the 50s or in the 60s, but they kind of protest against establishing reception center for Vietnamese refugees in the 70s. And this is the kind of artistic work by a Vietnamese, American Vietnamese artist. So that's the roots of the Vietnamese refugees in the 1970s. And well, okay, so this is the Guam Island, and this is the Subic Bay I just mentioned, and here is Taiwan. So there are all these places of the refugee camp for Vietnamese refugees since the late 1970s. And as I mentioned, that some of the refugees, especially those Chinese with Chinese background, ethnic background, were sent to Taiwan. And okay, so it's a kind of different ways that, if in comparison with the situation, the case in Hong Kong, the position of the ROC government vis-a-vis the international community actually was quite different. So, let me see. So what might be worth mentioning is that these Vietnamese refugees who were transported to the Guam under the military operation called Operation New Life in 1975 were not legally, they were not legally recognized as refugees by the U.S. government. All right, okay, I meant 5 minutes more. And in order for them to avoid international obligations associated with the refugees. So finally, a new wave of Chinese Vietnamese refugees occurred owing to the heightening tension between the PRC and the Vietnam since 1977. There is a border conflict afterward. And many of the refugees crossed the border and resettled in the return overseas Chinese farms on the borderland. Many fled by boat after the Sino-Vietnamese border was closed, and subsequent wars between PRC and Vietnam and between Vietnam and Cambodia broke out. The refugee crisis was escalated when the neighboring countries such as Malaysia, Thailand started to refoul refugees or tow refugee boats back to the sea. The UNHCR finally convened a conference in 1979, acknowledging that grave crises exist in Southeast Asia for hundreds of thousands of refugees, while Hong Kong, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, as well as the number of other countries were designated as first port of asylum. The ROC government had only a very minor role to play. However, the government tried to appropriate the crisis of the refugee, the Vietnamese poor people, to consolidate its image of the anti-communist stronghold in response to the decision of the U.S. to cut its diplomatic relations with the ROC, and when the demonstration led to an operation in the same year, 1979. So as a result, the few thousand Vietnamese refugees that were accommodated in the camp of Peng Hu by the ROC government has until now remained recognized in the UNHCR records. So that's why I say it's a kind of impossibility to have a properly refugee problem in Taiwan. So now I will come to a kind of a bit more generalization. So in the past 2 years, I've been working with another colleagues. We are doing interviews, documenting life stories, and working on archives. And We're also trying to develop an analytical framework. So, although I'm inspired by the recent development of international relations theory of regime or regime complex, I show you one of the kind of example. It's taken out from the work of a refugee scholar, a studies scholar, Alexander Betts, and that's the way he shows this so-called refugee regime complex. I will not confine myself to analyze the international regulatory frameworks as IR scholars usually do. Instead, I will also look at national institutions and also draw on theories of biopolitics and governmentality studies so as to address issues surrounding sovereignty, citizenship, human rights, knowledge production, power relations, and subjectivities. To summarize, focusing on the ways in which the problem of the Chinese refugee in Hong Kong and the problem of Vietnamese refugees in East and Southeast Asia were perceived and responded in the period between the 1950s and through the 1990s, I will investigate the following issues. The first, the configuration and transformation of the international refugee regime and its interaction with other international regimes such as development, security, and human rights. And of course, some of the contradictions and hierarchical orders within this complex. And second, the interrelationship between the refugee regime and other regimes of the ROC that would be more domestic or national, such as the citizens and border regime, and how it interacted further with the international refugee regime complex. Third, the influence of the Cold War on the refugee regime complex, especially I would like to kind of show you also this, yeah, we can see actually there's similar loops or lines here. If we compare this, the first island chain, here the red dotted line. So I would like to extend this, or instead, I mean, to bring in the U.S. aid, if there's such a thing as a U.S. aid regime, or the U.S. military-industrial complex, and how it has kind of related to the maybe we can call these island chains of refugees. So there is a kind of connection, so military bases, the refugee camps, and even later on, how these military bases were and refugee camps were transformed into spatial economic zones. And the last one will be, the fourth will be the combining effect of the territorial sovereign power and governmental rationalities reflected in the process of identification, transfer, and resettlement of the refugees. And finally, that would bring me back to the project of the Vietnamese community in Taiwan, is I would like to look at the transition from refugee regime to migration regime in Taiwan along the process of political economic regime transformation, both in Taiwan and in Vietnam since the mid-1980s. So I think I will stop here.
Would you like to comment on each other's papers?
Okay. Okay, so a few things that I can say about your paper. The first one is, yes, this obvious distinction between the refugee and the migrant. This was key in Europe, and it's funny with refugee and asylum systems that seem to be so straightforward about determining the refugee, but none of them have managed to make a distinction. And I think because, and it's in the interest of the system not to be clear, because it's necessary to be able to shift this category according to labor needs and movements. And as you said, people who start as labor migrants then can become refugees and then go back to labor migrants, and that's always in the interest of the system. the other thing that was thinking when you were talking is this idea of the good refugee and the bad refugee. You know, every country has their good refugees. In Europe, in the refugee crisis, it was Catholic Syrians were the good refugees as opposed to Muslim Africans. For the US and my research on Cuba, Cubans have for a very long time been the good refugee because they were kind of the politically converted. You know. And I guess that then I can see that in your work as well. Then this idea of the existence of an international asylum regime, which is necessary because people are moving across borders and it pertains to various sovereign states, but it's impossible to come to terms or to establish a system that takes into account these kinds of regional subtleties. So I actually think it's impossible to establish. And this last point that you were talking about, this connection between refugees and war, refugees and foreign relations, how people are used often as buffers in international conflicts. And of course refugees are the product of war. I mean, you don't have refugees without these types of conflicts. And I suppose finally, the idea of the refugee challenges the construction of the citizen. And we often talk about refugees, but the citizen is the non-mentioned side of the refugee, because it's that against which it is excluded, or for which it is given partial rights, temporary rights. And this goes right back to our first talks in the morning, you know, about equality, democracy, and the structure of the state and how the state includes or excludes. The refugee is by its definition a person who is not supposed to be a citizen. Otherwise, they become citizens. By creating the category of refugee, you create an exception that has to be always at the border, always regulated, always excluded. In a sense, irreconcilable with a citizen.
Maybe not a response, but I just kind of in comparison. Because the case you are talking about is rather about the refugee crisis in Europe, right? And my work actually focused more on, well, maybe there is no such a thing as refugee crisis in East Asia. Well, that may be the problem, okay? But I'm just wondering to what extent we can use your word of the corporatization of the management of the refugee vis-a-vis the management of a refugee by the nation states. Do you think there is a kind of not exactly variations or different way in which it develops in different regions? For instance, in Europe and in Southeast Asia, for instance, is that there's a kind of, I don't know, hierarchy, or is a kind of how should I say, a kind of different patterns, and also because the mode or the way in which the state functions, I think is quite different in Europe and in Southeast Asia, or even in East Asia. And also because if I can relate that to the interventions of the transnational organizations concerning the issue of refugees, I'm not sure whether, for instance, in East Asia, we have only, until now, I think South Korea or maybe Japan, they receive refugees and they have refugee law, but most of the countries do not. So I'm not sure whether, you know, the work can be kind of also address the issues in a more, you know, global way. That's my first question. And my second question is about the discourses of human rights, because from the cases you gave, I think we can see a kind of the deconstruction or a kind of critique of the practices of human rights. So I'm not sure, or I wonder whether you can say a bit more whether there is still any use of the discourses of human rights at this stage, and if it is, how? Any use of the human right? How can we make use of the human rights discourses when we deal with the issues of refugee, or apart from deconstructing, or to say that it might be already, it has its own specific articulations because of the current refugee regime, perhaps.
Okay, so as for the first question, can we think of this corporatization in terms of a global application? My experience in Latin America, for instance, is that yes, definitely. The role of NGOs in the movement of people and the disinterest and disengagement of the state is there as well. I don't know much about Southeast Asia, to be honest, but you mentioned the Ford Foundation. That's already a non-state corporate transnational. You mentioned UNHCR. These are institutions that respond to funding bodies, sometimes that are states, but not always, and increasingly less. The role of the state is certainly different, but I don't think that it stops being under the influence of corporate interests. So I would say yes. With its particularities of the region that I'm not getting into because I'm not competent, but I would say definitely this is a process that happens at a global scale. And in terms of how can we use human rights, every time I presented in Switzerland, people are very quick to defend human rights organizations. And it would be unfair to not recognize that their work has helped and helps people, and that human rights have achieved recognition for issues around the world, even sometimes at the cost of simplifying these issues, or sometimes at the cost of representing one group over another. This is often what happens in Latin America in issues around mining or water, and in indigenous communities that ascribe to human rights because it's an access to politics, but at the same time this reduces the complexity of the social structures within. So it's a tool, it's a tool to access certain recognitions. Like any tool, it can have a double edge. I suppose my argument is that in the context of the European refugee crisis, it also became a tool for both sides. So for people supporting the open doors policy, and for populist movements wanting to uphold, liberal European views, particularly when they were attacking, religious extremism, etc. So my point is, on their own, they're just because they're human and because they're rights doesn't mean necessarily that they are that they're going to have a positive result. At the same time, they became this egalitarian ideology at a time when there was a crisis of values and a crisis of structures, and so this is where they come into my analysis. I'm not trying to dismiss them.
If you see egalitarianism as a kind of movement, can we also see human rights not as a kind of fixed or articulated value? Instead, we can see it's also a kind of movement, right? So that would be my
After the discussion, I think we should open the floor to the floor. Does anyone raise some questions? If no one, can I throw something? Okay.
A question for Professor Shu-Fen. Thank you for your expose and the situation of the refugees in Taiwan. So for me, the new and then very good, because I was always asking myself why the refugees from in Africa, Asia, they always move to Europe, not coming to China or to Taiwan. And then Taiwan being an aging society with low birth, maybe the refugee, bringing in the refugee would be a solution to help the society. My question is about why is it important to use the case you just used about the Vietnamese refugee during the war today in today Taiwan. I would like to know the impact. How does refugees' presence change the Taiwanese society? Because in your expose you put more the stress on the government. I didn't feel the place of the people. Similarly, about the Hong Kong situation, how does this situation changing or impacting the Taiwanese society? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for the question. Well, the relevance of the Vietnamese refugees in Taiwan, actually, because as I start with my presentation, is actually a kind of background, or is part of my research project now on the Vietnamese community. Because when we look at the Vietnamese community here in Taiwan, I mean, if you interview, I mean, from our interviews, people will kind of resist that there is such a thing as a community, simply because they were people coming to Taiwan with different status or different identities and by different routes. They were refugees from South Vietnam, and they were now migrant workers from North Vietnam. You see what I mean? So there are kind of barriers for them, among different generations of the Vietnamese community. That's one of the reasons. And also because they now, what should I say? The second reason is the Vietnamese, as I say, the Vietnamese refugee in Taiwan, they were not only Chinese refugees. So for me, it will be a kind of opportunity to look at or to look back at the formation of the refugee policies in Taiwan, and to see not only the refugees policy but also the policies of migration in Taiwan in terms of the barrier of the citizenship, the border, and etc. Okay, so I think it affects the way in which the Taiwanese government or the Taiwanese people understand the community, the composition of our community as such. Okay, it's rather more exclusionary in a way. Okay, so I think it has its background or historical background. And the impact of the Hong Kongese and the situation in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, basically I think it is quite strange if we look back in the 50s. Because as we can see, for many people in Hong Kong, they will say, well, Hong Kong is a society of refugees, right? 难民社会. But in Taiwan, actually, it's very strange that people kind of just try to distance themselves from this very term of refugees. Although we know there are like 1 million of Chinese refugees coming to Taiwan in around 1949. But the very term of refugee is kind of forbidden, as I just explained. Okay, so there's a kind of the history. And I think it has a kind of peculiar impact, as I just said, the way in which we perceive the community. So I would just like kind of take the problem of refugee as the lens to look at the post-war development. I mean, in Taiwan, or maybe not necessarily only within Taiwan, because I think there is the possibility to compare Taiwan and also South Korea. Because normally we compare these two countries from the so-called state-led developmentalism. But I think there is a possibility to compare them and to connect them through the question of refugees, and also through the way in which both countries involved in the Vietnam War.
Eric?
I have a question for Marina. In your remarks, there was a moment when you mentioned in passing the new development economics, and sort of it sounded like you were implying that that kind of view of seeing the poor as a market, as consumers, as lendees, was sort of in step with this larger convergence between NGOization and neoliberalism. But I'm kind of wondering if you maybe could expand on that. I mean, do you see these things in step, or do you see a tension in the context where you do field work between that kind of a humanitarian model of the one-way gift assistance versus this kind of, I don't know whether it is even a term for it, this so-called post-humanitarianism perhaps, or even this kind of anti-humanitarian. I mean, I guess the example of the book, which was controversial, was of course Dambisa Moyo's book, Dead Aid, as making this argument that the Western model is terrible. We should look to the South, China specifically, or this idea that it's trade, not aid. And you get the impression, at least from the rhetoric, that there's this kind of opposition, so to speak, between this humanitarian ethos and this supposedly more egalitarian trade ethos. Like, we see you as a trade partner rather than as, this is a discourse among some Chinese involved in work in Africa that we see this as a trade partnership, and the word partner becomes used rather than, this is aid. So I'm just kind of wondering, from your sort of ethnographic situated kind of perspective, do you see that debate playing out, or does it have a different kind of permutation, which it is not obvious if one's just looking at sort of Dambisa Moyo and her critics?
No, I see it being played out. This is part of the whole thing. So, for instance, things like, microcredit for sure, but the International Committee for the Red Cross talks about the humanitarian bond, the humanitarian impact bond. This is something that they are developing. They want to act as a bank where they back up investments in high-risk places in order to promote investments by corporations and but relieve them from the risk of investing in insecure locations. This is one thing. There's a massive trend on social entrepreneurs, and this is sort of the supporting programs for the development of entrepreneurs that have a social side to them, and that also help to solve the problems within which they are embedded. So in Switzerland, for instance, there's lots of seed money to support NGOs that are developing social entrepreneur programs for refugee integration in Switzerland, for instance, or for refugee resettlement back home. So it's all part, I see it as all part of this transformation of the humanitarian system in line with a corporate structure of aid. So, aid changed from charity. Aid is not supposed to be charity, it was something else, but already it's something else to what it was when it was established in the 1960s and 70s, which was emergency relief. It was something to be, short-term, Now aid has developed into a more long-term thing. There is within the discourse in humanitarian organizations, there is a complete acceptance that crises are permanent, and that what has to change is not so much the way in which we solve crises, but the mentality of these NGOs that solve crises is something that was short-term. I mean, what they have to do now is engage differently, because these are permanent situations, and the way in which they do it is by partnering with the social responsibility branches of corporate foundations, like MasterCard has programs in most of the large refugee centers where they give cash through credit card programs. The IKEA Foundation sets up houses for, kind of makeshift accommodations for people on the move. It's all corporate solutions. And so, yes, it's donations and it's part aid, but it's also a market. And I don't know if you've read Linda Pullman's book on humanitarian camps in, I think it was Lebanon, I can't remember, where she kind of moves through a market of aid, basically. So you have Save the Children will do this. Caritas will do that, and when you get into this world of humanitarianism, you have to know who does what, because you don't double up the work, And so everybody has their kind of little niche market, and you have to find your market. This is how they talk about it. They talk about it in those terms. Find your niche. So, because what's the point of doing something that somebody else has already done? So let's find our niche and kind of invest in that social problem.
Maybe a question for Marina, and then a question for Shu-Fen. Marina, then what is the alternative? And actually, refugees or stateless persons, they are never a short-term issues nowadays. Okay, it's increasing. So the stateless persons, they are stateless because of all different kinds of reasons. And who is going to offer support or help? Of course, we know in the refugee camps throughout the world, there are drugs, there are violence, there are internal, maybe shadow economy, but also maybe more dark things. For example, ISIS training programs and so on, of course. But what are your suggested alternatives? I mean, who offer support? You sounded a little bit very cynical, I mean, in many ways. But it also it's similar to Professor Shu-Fen's question. Then is human right not a term we should address, or is it dirty words, okay, that we can never touch because it's a Western concept, it's this and that and this and that. So when there are people, for example, in Taiwan, we do have many thousands of stateless children because they cannot be owned by their parents. And who help them? If government, they don't, because it's taxpayers' money, they don't. So it must be local NGOs, maybe church, okay, maybe other shelters and so on. So I just, this is a very basic question on who offers help if they are not citizens. If the citizens don't want to spend their tax money for these outsiders. And these refugees, as you know, as you said, millions, and not only refugees, but stateless persons, they are coming out, appearing, emerging in all societies. So what's your alternative? And for Shu-Fen's question, in Southeast Asia, there are refugee crises. For example, into China, okay, not only those are Chinese, ethnic Chinese, but all right, maybe no. I was just because several people came to our institute and gave us several talks on this issue: refugee, the Balkan route, or this Mediterranean Sea, or South China's Southeast Asia, and or Malaysia. They have received refugees from Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, but also not only Chinese, but the Khmer Krom and the Hmong and the Highland people and the people from Philippines. They are, during this last century, second half of the last century, there are all these refugees, okay, because it's wars surround this. But of course, nowadays, still there's Southern Thailand people and also Myanmar. They are still. But I was the thing I wanted to say that is that those both people, Vietnamese people, said they are all very rich people, so that they could get out, and they became refugees. Okay, there's no more than one person, but many Vietnamese people commented on that. They don't want to be persecuted by the communists coming down after the unification, right? So that's just one curiosity that whether during your interview or your talk with them, there are something related. Yeah.
No, it's okay. I don't know what the alternative is. I mean, really, I always get this question, you know, so what then, what do we do, what does it mean, you know, I mean, this is not the objective, I suppose, of the exercise. I guess what is important to me to clarify is that if we look at these institutions and these frameworks, such as human rights, as the solution to problems created by the state, then we're not understanding that they are part of the problem because they are inherent in the structures of the state, and they participate in the processes of corporatization that generate the refugees in the first place. And so you have institutions that participate because they are symptomatic of the situation, that are trying to do what they can to salvage or to diminish the impacts of the situation. And I think if we can understand them as such, then we don't look at them as the savior institutions that they often either proclaim to be or are expected to be. In the meantime, there is no denying that they are helping people, that if they weren't there, people would be dying. But at the same time, there's no denying that they are facilitating certain kinds of interventions into countries that, if they weren't facilitating, perhaps those countries would not be then degrading into what is then a refugee crisis. So it's just simply that, you know, and which is why this topic has been very difficult during every presentation has always been challenging, because it's, you know, basically kind of opening up a box of problems without presenting any alternative solution. But I think that if we can see the problem for what it is, then at least we are not, you know, masked by what it's supposed to solve.
Okay, of course, I think there are always refugees in a broad sense. But I think what I'm talking about rather is about from a more kind of institutional point of view, or from the regime point of view, is how the refugees are conceived or defined, or whether they are kind of the categorization of or the identification of the refugees. So of course, like we can say, well, it's quite, yeah, I'm here. well, it's quite provocative. I mean, not only here in Taiwan, but we can say, when I say there is no, or there was no refugee crisis, it depends. For instance, if we see there's a kind of so-called internally displaced persons in the Korean War, or I mean the Chinese Civil War and all this kind of thing. So the thing is how and why certain people they flee are categorized or identified as refugees while others are not. So I think there is a kind of parity inherent in this. And also by saying this, we can look at what I say. I mean, there's a kind of interplay or combination or combining effect of the sovereign power and also the power of governmentality. I think, yes, that's it.
The rich people?
Oh, the rich people. Well, it is kind of very strange. For instance, I have a Vietnamese student who is kind of young, and you know, before I talk to her, she knows only very little about poor people. She didn't even, sometimes, I mean, she would admit that she didn't even heard about that when she was in Vietnam. And she said she started to learn Vietnamese history after she comes to Taiwan. So that's kind of answer. I don't know whether, you know, that's satisfying because I mean, there's a myth.
I would like to show something here and probably stimulate some discussion. Because my observation of this question is that it seems to me that this definitely has so-called refugee crisis everywhere, even in Asia. But it seems to me that in East Asia or even Southeast Asia, we have trouble accept the notion of refugee. The impossibility of forming ideology of refugee. That's something very obvious contrast to European, because you have citizenship very clearly defined by universal principle, especially human rights. So it's very clear there that refugee is very clear. But in East Asia, I mean, think of the graduate, I want graduate citizenship. The concept like you don't define citizenship in a universal way. I mean, you define it in a graduate way. So in that kind of circumstance, it's very difficult for people to accept refugee as a category. So that's why I think this is the kind of problem we are facing right now. And I'll also add in something into this of the Chinese concept of Kai-Shyh, the kind of concept, because it's a centralizing concept. Therefore, everybody in a way is refugee. For example, Taiwan. I mean, most of the Taiwanese have strong refugee mentality. I mean, they live here, but they are refugees. They want to go to the United States. They want to go other places. Even the people who live so-called native Chinese in Taiwan, the Taiwanese, I mean, after the KMT come to take over, a lot of them have this notion of refugee. They want immigrant to Japan, to America. So it's kind of like we don't have a very strong sense of, we have this idea of going to the center. We are looking at the center. Looking at the center define our citizen, our relation to the state. So in that kind of concept, that kind of sovereignty concept, it's kind of difficult for the refugee to be constructed. That's my observation.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. I mean, this point, I wish I had that last point, but it seems that I didn't. So I think it's very important to say because of this unstable or somehow graduated sovereignty in many of the East Asian countries, or maybe also of the contested status of sovereignty in Southeast Asia. So that makes somehow, because of the legal, of course we are talking about the legal definition of refugee, not only, the everyday language. That makes the difference. Yeah.
Yeah.
I just want to add something that in Taiwan, we would not consider ourselves as a kind of society of refugees, but we will always say that we are societies of immigrants or migrants. Of course, then they have the aspiration for better life. Yeah.
Yeah, I find it that's a very interesting point. I was specifically this idea of the graduated citizenship and the notion of positioning the citizen in relation to something outside. I see that in refugees around Latin America because they always want to go to the US. So anywhere that they are is a temporary place. Nowhere is safe enough anyway until they get to the US. But this idea of the graduated citizen, I'm going to keep that in mind because that's something that is very particular to Europe where, which is what is closing Europe as well off. And especially with this Schengen and the free circulation, because this is what Europe is a market. This is why people want to go there for work, which makes the category of refugee so difficult to establish because as opposed to a migrant and so.
Probably the last question is
it's a question and then an observation at the same time. I fully agree with Professor Lin and Shu-Fen when we talk that in Taiwan, you somehow not really like the term refugee. Let us not stand on the foot of someone who is coming in to look at the opposite, hospitality. Because it's also challenged the way how we are hospitable when we talk about the refugees. If you look at what Derrida tried to develop around hospitality, within it having hostility against the one who is coming outside. It is true that we want to go outside. What about those coming from outside? Are we ready to welcome them? And the same observation about the situation in Europe. The Europe somehow opened up the border, putting up the concept of the citizenship, the citizen of the Europe, with all the Schengen, everything, which is for true economical. At the same time, I find a big problem if I tackle it on the level of ethics, with all the fundraising being done by the NGO from those people who are creating the crisis. Let us say you do the fundraising to Apple, to Huawei, you take the money from them, you want to solve the situation that they have created. So I just think that there is something wrong already with the way they are working. So they need really also to adjust their way of tackling this situation. Thank you.
Okay. I think it's not a question, it's just a comment. And thank you, for your wonderful comment. And that's end this section. With this lively talk, and yeah, really, really nice. Okay, I'll give it to Alan for us.
I think we had a very productive, long day. So I'd like to thank all the participants, not just the speakers, the chairs who were very engaging, and the participants as well. There's a lot to digest, so no comments from me. I prefer to digest over dinner. So thank you, and